Good afternoon, Madam President. I rise in opposition to the bill that is before us. I've been listening to the debate back and forth since the beginning, and I'm certainly sympathetic to the arguments on both sides of this policy decision. For those who are just catching up, this bill that is before us aims to remove people from the state's sex offender registry, and that's based on the argument that the registry was passed at a certain point in our history about 20 years ago, and it was made retroactive at the time, and therefore encapsulated crimes and offenders that had previous to the passage of the new law been convicted of a crime that would make them eligible. And it's interesting to me that this is coming to us so many years after that happened, although I don't doubt that there's been efforts in the past to adjust this policy. And I guess the proponents of the legislation are making the argument that somehow it's unfair to the folks that were added to this registry because at the time that they committed their crime, or they were convicted of that crime, or they pled to some sort of agreement, this registry did not exist, and therefore they did not know that they would end up on such a registry in the future. And that is certainly a compelling argument. But I do want to clarify a few things. First and foremost, I heard two main focuses of conversation here. One was about fairness. There was a lot of talk about what's fair, and we can come back to that. The second part was about the public safety aspect of this and looking out for people in our communities who might rightly and deservedly want to know who is on the sex offender registry. But the one thing that was not mentioned was the victims of these crimes when they were originally perpetrated. I'm going to make just a couple of very quick points, but I think that there are extremely important and valuable points that ought to be taken into consideration when considering this policy. The first and foremost is that we're looking at this so far downstream from when this was originally debated. I am certain when the bill was originally passed, there was a discussion about whether it needed to be made prospective or retroactive. And the policy decision was made by both chambers, passed into law, with the idea that it was best as a protection for the citizens of Connecticut as a retroactive policy, and also as a protection for, or as a recognition of the pain to the victims that were involved at the time. So for me, I think it's a hard thing to do to go back so many years later and undo a policy like this, because I would argue they were in the midst of it. They probably had a better idea what the impact was going to be on those folks retroactively than we do, even so many years later. And maybe the argument is there's so many fewer individuals involved now that so much time has elapsed that maybe it is worth looking at. But I would argue exactly the opposite, because for me, the issue is that if you're still on the sex offender registry today, you were among the worst offenders. I have two questions for the proponent of the bill. Madam President, if we can clear this up. I'm reading the OLR bill analysis, and I would just like to verify that the only way you could still be on the registry today is if you committed a second or third offense of a crime where the victim was a minor. I'm trying to find the other pages, forgive me. Or a non-violent sexual offense, but it would have to be a subsequent offense, or it would have to be categorized as a sexually violent offense, because those are lifetime. My point is that for the first offenses for someone who commits a crime against a minor, it goes away after 10 years. So that person would no longer be on the registry today. And if they committed a non-violent sexual offense and it was their first offense, that would not be on the registry anymore. So you're talking only about people that have committed a sexually violent offense, and only people who have committed a second or subsequent offense of the other types of crimes. Is that correct, through you, Madam President?
Thank you. Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Madam President, and I'm glad the questioner took a moment to lay out his question so I could actually read the summary, which is not normally where I'm looking. But yes, the summary talks about the categories that the good senator, sorry, I do it every once in a while. Good senator is talking about and lays them out, talking about the number of years that would place one on the registry, and Senator Sampson does read the OLR summary correctly.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President, and I appreciate you confirming that information. So we're talking not about someone who committed a first and minor offense. We're talking about someone who committed at least 2 offenses or a sexually violent offense. That's what we're talking about here. There may be a third category, too, that is captured by virtue of the fact that if someone during this period, 1988 to 1998, was convicted of a very serious crime, and they may still, in fact, be serving time for it. Is that possible, through you, Madam President, that someone may be serving a time that they will ultimately leave prison after having committed a crime during that period and end up on the sexual offense registry if this bill does not pass, through you, Madam President?
Senator Winfield.
Thank you, Madam President. Oftentimes when people are asking you hypotheticals, you have to really make sure that you've heard what they're putting forward to try to answer the question. I believe the answer to the question here is yes.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate the chairman's response and navigating my very poorly worded question. So, and that's all the questions I have. But I just want to clarify for the record that these are the people that we're talking about. The universe of people that we are referring to is limited only to people who committed violent sexual offenses or a second or subsequent nonviolent or an offense against a person under the age of 13, or it's somebody who's in prison right now. And if this bill passes, we'll be removing those folks, including someone who may have been serving since the late 80s and early 90s for a very, very serious sexual crime. I can't support this, Madam President. For me, it is not really a question of fairness, because we are not talking about people that may have been caught up or wrapped up in something. And I can understand all the arguments about the plea bargains and so forth. It's a very important thing to note, by the way, that while the sex offender registry may not have existed back when this law passed, the record existed. It was not a secret. It was not something that someone would have to FOIA to find out. It was a matter of public record. And when someone is convicted of a crime, the public has a right to know about it. And if they plea to a crime or lesser crime, they are acknowledging that crime. They are admitting that crime, and that is also a public record. The idea that somehow the sex offender registry goes so much farther than that, I don't think is accurate. Any person, any private person could have compiled their own sex offender registry out of the public records and still can, whether this happens or not. My concern really is that we make sure that the public is aware of folks who've been convicted of these crimes that are on the registry for good reason. This was a public policy decision made by this state many years ago, and it, I believe, was a correct one. Certainly, there has been conversation in recent years about making different categories of different crimes so that people can be treated more fairly. I'm open to that. But this bill, which is going to take effectively the worst offenders and remove them from the list, I don't think is a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea for public safety, and I don't think it is fair to the victims of those crimes. I'll be a no today. Thank you, Madam President.